Operation Torch was the British-American invasion of French North Africa during the North African Campaign of the Second World War, which started on the 8th of November 1942. The Soviet Union had pressed the United States and United Kingdom to start operations in Europe and open a second front to reduce the pressure of German forces on the Soviet troops, while the American commanders favored Operation Sledgehammer, landing in occupied Europe as soon as possible. The British commanders believed that such a course would end in disaster. An attack on French North Africa was proposed instead, which would clear the Axis powers from North Africa, improve naval control of the Mediterranean Sea, and prepare for an invasion of southern Europe in 1943. American President Franklin D. Roosevelt suspected the African operation would rule out an invasion of Europe in 1943 but agreed to support British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Background: the Allies planned an Anglo-American invasion of northwestern Africa, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, territory nominally in the hands of the Vichy French government, with much of North Africa already under Allied control. This would allow the Allies to carry out a pincer operation against Axis forces in North Africa. The Vichy French had around 125,000 soldiers in the territories as well as coastal artillery, 210 operational but out-of-date tanks and about 500 aircraft, half of which were Duartina D-520 fighters, equal to many British and U.S. fighters. These forces included 60,000 troops in Morocco, 15,000 in Tunisia, and 50,000 in Algeria. In addition, there were 10 or so warships and 11 submarines at Casablanca. The Allies believed that the Vichy French forces would not fight, partly because of information supplied by American consul Robert Daniel Murphy in Algiers. The French were former allies of the U.S., and the American troops were instructed not to fire unless they were fired upon. However, they harbored suspicions that the Vichy French Navy would bear a grudge over the British action at Mers el-Kabir in 1940. An assessment of the sympathies of the French forces in North Africa was essential, and plans were made to secure their cooperation, rather than resistance. German support for the Vichy French came in the shape of air support. Several Luftwaffe bomber wings undertook anti-shipping strikes against Allied ports in Algiers and along the North African coast. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was given command of the operation, and he set up his headquarters in Gibraltar. The Allied naval commander of the expeditionary force would be Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham. His deputy was Vice Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, who would plan the amphibious landings. Allied planners identified Oran and also Algiers and Casablanca as key targets. Ideally, there should also be a landing at Tunis to secure Tunisia and facilitate the rapid interdiction of supplies traveling via Tripoli to Rommel's forces in Libya. However, Tunis was much too close to the Axis airfields in Sicily and Sardinia for any hope of success. A compromise would be to land at Bone, some 300 miles closer to Tunis than Algiers. Limited resources dictated that the Allies could only make 3 landings, and Eisenhower, who believed that any plan must include landings at Oran and Algiers, had 2 main options. Either the western option, to land at Casablanca, Oran and Algiers and then make as rapid a move as possible to Tunis, some 500 miles east of Algiers once the Vichy opposition was suppressed, or the eastern option, to land at Oran, Algiers and Bone and then advance overland to Casablanca some 500 miles west of Oran. He favored the eastern option because of the advantages it gave to an early capture of Tunis and also because the Atlantic swells off Casablanca presented considerably greater risks to an amphibious landing there than would be encountered in the Mediterranean. The combined chiefs of staff, however, were concerned that should Operation Torch precipitate Spain to abandon neutrality and join the Axis, the Straits of Gibraltar could be closed, cutting the entire Allied forces' lines of communication. They therefore chose the Casablanca option as the less risky, since the forces in Algeria and Tunisia could be supplied overland from Casablanca in the event of closure of the Straits. Eisenhower, in accepting this, pointed out that the decision removed the early capture of Tunis from the probable to only the remotely possible because of the extra time it would afford the Axis to move forces into Tunisia. Intelligence gathering. In July 1941, Myacheslaw Slowakowski set up Agency Africa, one of the Second World War's most successful intelligence organizations. His Polish allies in these endeavors included Lt. Col. Guido Langer and Major Maximilian Siecki. The information gathered by the agency was used by the Americans and British in planning the amphibious November 1942 Operation Torch landings in North Africa. Preliminary contact with Vichy French. To gauge the feeling of the Vichy French forces, Murphy was appointed to the American consulate in Algeria. His covert mission was to determine the mood of the French forces and to make contact with elements that might support an Allied invasion. He succeeded in contacting several French officers, including General Charles Mast, the French commander-in-chief in Algiers. These officers were willing to support the Allies, but asked for a clandestine conference with a senior Allied general in Algeria. Major General Mark W. Clark, one of Eisenhower's senior commanders, was dispatched to Seychelles in Algeria aboard the British submarine HMS Seraph and met with these Vichy French officers on 21 October 1942. With help from the resistance, the Allies also succeeded in slipping French General Henry Giraud out of Vichy France on HMS Seraph, passing itself off as an American submarine, intending to offer him the post of Commander-in-Chief of French forces in North Africa after the invasion. However, Giraud would take no position lower than Commander-in-Chief of all the invading forces, a job already given to Eisenhower. When he was refused, he decided to remain a spectator in this affair. Battle. The Allies organized 3 amphibious task forces to seize the key ports and airports of Morocco and Algeria simultaneously, targeting Casablanca, Oran and Algiers. Successful completion of these operations was to be followed by an advance eastwards into Tunisia. A Western task force comprised American units, with Major General George S. Patton in command and Rear Admiral Henry K. Hewitt heading the naval operations. This Western task force consisted of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division and the U.S. 3rd and 9th Infantry Divisions, 35,000 troops in a convoy of over 100 ships. They were transported directly from the U.S. in the first of a new series of UG convoys providing logistic support for the North African campaign. The Center Task Force, aimed at Oran, included the U.S. 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment, the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, and the U.S. 1st Armored Division, a total of 18,500 troops. They sailed from Britain and were commanded by Major General Lloyd Fredendall, the naval forces being commanded by Commodore Thomas Trowbridge. Torch was, for propaganda purposes, a landing by U.S. forces, supported by British warships and aircraft, under the belief that this would be more palatable to French public opinion than an Anglo-American invasion. For the same reason, Churchill suggested that British soldiers might wear U.S. Army uniforms, although there is no evidence that this tactic was implemented. In reality, the Eastern Task Force, aimed at Algiers, was commanded by a British Lieutenant General, Kenneth Anderson, and consisted of a brigade from the British 78th and the U.S. 34th Infantry Divisions, along with 2 British commando units, totaling 20,000 troops. During the landing phase, ground forces were to be commanded by U.S. Major General Charles W. Ryder, commander of the 34th Division and naval forces, were commanded by Vice Admiral Sir Harold Burrow. U-boats, operating in the eastern Atlantic area crossed by the invasion convoys, had been drawn away to attack trade convoy SL-125. Some historians have suggested the timing of this trade convoy was an intentional tactical diversion to prevent submarine attacks on the troop transports. Aerial operations were split into two, east of Cape Tenaz in Algeria, with British aircraft under Air Marshal Sir William Welsh, and west of Cape Tenaz, all American aircraft under Major General Jimmy Doolittle, under the direct command of Major General Patton. P-40s of the 33rd Fighter Group were launched from U.S. Navy escort carriers and landed at Port Lyautey on November 10. Additional air support was provided by the carrier US Ranger, whose squadrons intercepted Vichy aircraft and bombed hostile ships. Casablanca. The Western Task Force landed before daybreak on 8 November 1942, at 3 points in Morocco: Safi, Fedala, and Media. Port Lyautey. Because it was hoped that the French would not resist, there were no preliminary bombardments. This proved to be a costly error as French defenses took a toll of American landing forces. On the night of 7 November, pro-Allied General Antoine Berthoat attempted a coup d'état against the French command in Morocco, so that he could surrender to the Allies the next day. His forces surrounded the villa of General Charles Nogues, the Vichy loyal High Commissioner. However, Nogues telephoned loyal forces, who stopped the coup. In addition, the coup attempt alerted Nogues to the impending Allied invasion, and he immediately bolstered French coastal defenses at Safi, the objective being capturing the port facilities to land the Western Task Force's medium tanks. The landings were mostly successful. The landings were begun without covering fire, in the hope that the French would not resist at all. However, once French coastal batteries opened fire, Allied warships returned fire. By the time General Harmon arrived, French snipers had pinned the assault troops on Safi's beaches. Most of the landings occurred behind schedule. Carrier aircraft destroyed a French truck convoy bringing reinforcements to the beach defenses. Safi surrendered on the afternoon of 8 November. By 10 November, the remaining defenders were pinned down, and the bulk of Harmon's forces raced to join the siege of Casablanca. At Port Lyautey, the landing troops were uncertain of their position, and the second wave was delayed. This gave the French defenders time to organize resistance, and the remaining landings were conducted under artillery bombardment. With the assistance of air support from the carriers, the troops pushed ahead, and the objectives were captured. At Fedala, where they disrupted the landings, the landing beaches again came under French fire after daybreak. Patton landed at 800, and the beachheads were secured later in the day. The Americans surrounded the port of Casablanca by 10 November, and the city surrendered an hour before the final assault was due to take place. Casablanca was the principal French Atlantic naval base after German occupation of the European coast. The naval battle of Casablanca resulted from a sortie of French cruisers, destroyers, and submarines opposing the landings. A cruiser, 6 destroyers, and 6 submarines were destroyed by American gunfire and aircraft. The incomplete French battleship Jean Bat, which was docked in a mobile, fired on the landing force with her one working gun turret until disabled by gunfire. 2 U.S. destroyers were damaged. Oran. The center task force was split between 3 beaches, 2 west of Oran and 1 east. Landings at the westernmost beach were delayed because of a French convoy which appeared while the minesweepers were clearing a path. Some delay and confusion, and damage to landing ships, was caused by the unexpected shallowness of water and sandbars. Although periscope observations had been carried out, no reconnaissance parties had landed on the beaches to determine the local maritime conditions. This was in contrast to later amphibious assaults, such as Operation Overlord, in which considerable weight was given to pre-invasion reconnaissance. The U.S. 1st Ranger Battalion landed east of Oran and quickly captured the shore battery at Arzew. An attempt was made to land U.S. infantry at the harbor directly, in order to quickly prevent destruction of the port facilities and scuttling of ships. The operation, codenamed Operation Reservist, failed, as the two Banff-class sloops were destroyed by crossfire from the French vessels there. The Vichy French naval fleet broke from the harbor and attacked the Allied invasion fleet, but its ships were all sunk or driven ashore. French batteries and the invasion fleet exchanged fire throughout 8 to 9 November, with French troops defending Oran and the surrounding area stubbornly. Heavy fire from the British battleships brought about Oran's surrender on 9 November. Airborne Landings Torch was the first major airborne assault carried out by the United States. The U.S. 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment flew all the way from Britain, over Spain, intending to drop near Oran and capture airfields at Tafarora and La Sania, respectively 15 miles and 5 miles south of Oran. The operation was marked by weather, navigational and communication problems. Poor weather over Spain and the extreme range caused the formation to scatter and forced 30 of the 37 aircraft to land in the dry salt lake to the west of the objective. Nevertheless, both airports were captured. Algiers resistance and coup as agreed at Cherchell. In the early hours of the 8th of November 400 mainly Jewish French resistance fighters staged a coup in the city of Algiers. Starting at midnight, the force under the command of Henry d'Astier de la Vigérie and José Abolca seized key targets, including the telephone exchange, radio station, governor's house and the headquarters of 19th Corps. Robert Murphy took some men and then drove to the residence of General Alphonse Juin, the senior French army officer in North Africa. While they surrounded his house, Murphy attempted to persuade him to side with the Allies. However, he was treated to a surprise. Admiral François Darlan, the commander of all French forces, was also in Algiers on a private visit. Juin insisted on contacting Darlan, and Murphy was unable to persuade either to side with the Allies. In the early morning, the local gendarmerie arrived and released both Juin and Darlan. Invasion on 8 November 1942, the invasion commenced with landings split between 3 beaches, 2 west of Algiers and 1 east, under overall command of Major General Charles W. Ryder, Commander U.S. 34th Infantry Division, British 11th Brigade Group from British 78th Infantry Division, landed on the right-hand beach. U.S. 168th Regimental Combat Team, from U.S. 34th Infantry Division, supported by 6th Commando and most of 1st Commando on the Middle Beach, while U.S. 39th Regimental Combat Team, also from 34th Division, supported by the remaining 5 troops from 1st Commando, landed on the left-hand beach. British 36th Brigade Group from 78th Division stood by in floating reserve. Though some landings went to the wrong beaches, this was immaterial, because of the extremely low level of French opposition. All the coastal batteries had been neutralized by French resistance, and one French commander openly welcomed the landing Allies. The only fighting took place in the port of Algiers, where in Operation Terminal, 2 British destroyers attempted to land a party of U.S. Rangers directly onto the dock, in order to prevent the French destroying the port facilities and scuttling their ships. Heavy artillery fire prevented one destroyer from landing, but the other was able to disembark 250 Rangers before it too was driven back to sea. The landed troops pushed quickly inland and General Juin surrendered the city to the Allies at 1800.